English is a language of communication because the English-speaking people colonized the world. So therefore, through cultural imperialism, they impose their language as a medium of instruction. But at the same time, in the same paradigm, we will be saying English is lacking in vocabulary to define certain things about us. It is limited. In the very same breath again, we'll be saying isintu asitolokwa. You can't translate. Actually, this is my direct experience. I studied in Ethiopia. I studied Amharic, one of the East African languages, Ethiopian languages. I quickly learned that there is no direct translation from Amharic to English. For instance, Amharic, it has the verb in the end of the sentence. If you are going to say God is love, it is like God love is, if you're going to write it directly like that. But again, you must be within the psychology of those people to speak in that particular way. But if you take it into English, it makes no logical sense at all. So you are at home with your language. You are comfortable with your language. But we also, as Abantu, as Black African people, we need to understand the depth and the importance of our language in all aspects of things.
Language is sehopotso. So sehopotso is remembrance. Language is something that for me feels like a river, and how rivers interconnect with every part of our land and bring us together. And because rivers are containers of water and water contains memory, it's almost like when you start to speak a language of your forefathers or your foremothers, the language sort of activates a sense of remembrance of self, a sense of remembrance of purpose, a sense of connection to your identity, a sense of an activation of pride, a sense of remembering your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, and everybody else before you. So there's something around when we use our own languages, especially when we speak when we speak even in a daily thing, there's something around when you use your own languages in that it sort of activates something that sometimes we've forgotten because we've been so much socialized into a languaging, whether it's the physical language that we use, which we're using now, which is Sekgowa. There's something in which then it reverses that decoding that we have even within ourselves and our own remembrance. So I think that when we then rebitsa or rekopana or rerutiwa or rehudisiwa in languages that are not of our own innately, from our own conceptual birth, is that it almost feels sometimes it's a colonization of spirit. It's almost like a reverse alchemy, almost like this spell that then forces you to forget yourself.
Our ancestors apprenticed to nature, and that's how we created all of our indigenous languages. It is through the listening to the vibrations and tonal frequencies of the natural sounds that all indigenous people have created language. So one of the key factors in this modern time where we have so much pollution and a climate crisis and an environmental crisis, what language first does in terms of conservation efforts, our indigenous languages mirror nature and call us to a reverence to nature. So that is one of the first things in terms of an earth consciousness that it does.
I'll take us through our different institutions. Let's talk about the institution of healing, Obungoma, Obunyanga. These were historically the deepest, profound preservers of our language. Even today, if you go into Bupedi, you go into those places, you find that the people who are still holding on to the pure language, to the language, whether it's Pedi or Kilobedu in its purest sense, is their traditional healers. The next institution is Amakosi, The next institution is the initiation schools. Now you take it to the Botswana, we had about 10 initiation schools, 10 different initiation schools. Initiation ya Bongoma, initiation ya Mabuto, initiation ya Bukosi, initiation ya Bunyanga, ya Bafana, from boys to men, and so forth and so forth. But all of these things, they have their own languages. It's like you sit and you listen to the Basotho music, you know, traditional music. You hear, even as a Sotho speaking person, you can hear that this particular Sotho they speak here, it is of particular institution, and mostly is of the institution of initiation school. Majority of them, they speak in that one of the initiation school. But you go again into the institution of African spirituality in general. Like for instance, the prayers that I do in Sesotho, they use deep old words. Some of them, they're out of use now because they were never preserved. You know, with our Europeanization or colonization and civilization, we started to leave other things behind and therefore try to accommodate. And most of the time now we're using what we call ma'adingwa, which is borrowed words. Like you ask 99.9% of black children, if you ask them what is a window in their language, but look at fenster. But the fenster come from fenster, which is Afrikaans for window. And we have so many words like that, which are borrowed words, which is ma'adingwa, that we adimile from these other people to express ourselves. So that itself is a cultural concern, in a sense that it's a sign of a dying language.
You go to an English medium school, you go to an Afrikaans school, that language has then been used to weaponize ourselves. And so what happens is that what I've experienced in my generation is that when we're through that periphery of being oppressed through language and then having the freedom to express ourselves in whatever, however, what we then equate the English medium language to and whatever is good schools, is access, is privilege, and all of those kind of things. So then when it was the kids correcting us around our language, when we try to speak English and they correct us, it's us who are enforcing that onto the kids around speaking good English. And that's why you all even see in social media how people are victimized from having an accent that is a particular way, how people are ostracized for not speaking English properly, how we've elevated the language of the colonizer infiltrates how we also now have started to bring up our children. That's why they don't have an interest. The thing comes from us to show them that there's an interest that we have to keep the essence and the knowledge and the desire and even the passion and even wanting to learn our languages.
On a UN level, there is a mandate which is there globally around the fact that indigenous cultures are dying and languages are dying. And on a practical everyday level, indigenous communities, us as indigenous people being connected to the natural world, which has not become westernized or modernized where it's just a consumer space. We are the ones that take care of nature. So if a lot of young people are now moving away from their languages, moving away from the culture, it means that those who are guardians and custodians of nature, like your indigenous people in the Amazon, without the indigenous people in the Amazon living there, taking care of that land through the spiritual activities that they do, without us as indigenous people, even in South Africa, continuing to go etinzabeni siyophahla or Eswatini in the beautiful ceremonies we have around the solstices and equinoxes, there's a certain disassociation which becomes there and a vulnerability that then the earth within itself loses the custodians of nature.
Now, what is a people without a language? You know, there is no people. Every people have their own language. Now, once you lose your language, you're beginning to lose yourself. As we said, that the language is a door to culture. The language is a carrier of your concepts, your ideas and your principles. So if you lose the language, you're going to lose your ideas, you're going to lose your principles, you're going to lose your concepts, you're going to lose yourself ultimately, because most of the paradigms that we're using now, even in this African spirituality space, and the argument that we're making, mostly they're based on the language. I'll be like, there's no hell in my language. There is no hell, you know, there is no heaven and hell. When you pass, we have a dimu, you know. So you see, it is still helping to ground us in a particular cosmology, in our own cosmology, in our own ontology, because with Africans, religion is a poetic state of mind. And you hear it in how we pray, you know, menzi wasemandulo, simakate sezulu, mveli nqangi, sonini nanini, hlanga lamakhosi, ndlula mithi yamakhosi, and all of this is pure poetry, because it's a poetic state of mind. Now when we're feeling very poetic about the heavens, when we're feeling very poetic about God, when we're feeling very poetic about the spiritual realm, so we express it in a particular language that is not the common language that ordinary Nguni speakers will be putting it in that way. Mangithi qamata katai. How many Xhosa people know die? You know? Thixo wasembo. How many Xhosa people know what mbo is? Embo, masibuyeleni embo, lasivela khona, which is basically sankofa, which is basically that let's sankofate, let's go back to pick up ourselves. So all of these things are preserved in the language. So should we continue to lose the language, we are going to little by little lose ourselves and begin to define ourselves in other people's ideas, other people's concepts, other people's principles.
Where Mahayeng is the best way. You don't have the cushioning of your mother having to translate for you or to throw in an English word here and there to try and give you comfort. Or gogomkhulu or whatever. But in their mother tongue, and that's why it's the mother tongue. So I always feel like when you've got an opportunity to take your kids in places where that's all they speak, right? In their everyday language, there's something around how then it does that thing that I was talking about. It then re-engineers memory, and then it becomes a lived experience for them. And then I think for then it makes it easier for them to actually be comfortable over time around the language. When we're here and I'm forcing you and I'm taking you to classes or whatever it is that you think it would be, or we sit and I repeat after me, what does this mean and whatever, there's also a sense of resentment that would have that, because also what do? We speak to each other as adults in English. You know, so there's all of those kind of things. So I think for me, when you've got an opportunity to, and you've got a home where you know, and they naturally they will speak the mother tongue. Have interest in speaking in English to each other. She needs to play with those kids, you know. And I think I've seen, even my daughter that I was talking about, the reason why then she took it on very easily, even more, was when we went home and she'd be having to speak to other children in order to play with them. That's how then it became comfortable. And it's also in the safe space of having to play with kids that you've got no choice but to speak their language.
And within an indigenous space, I really feel that I'll speak to my experience. You mentioned earlier that I've lived abroad and I went to the States. What I went there to do was to do work around a lot of African Americans or Black Americans, people of color there, being called by their ancestors, being called by the land, being called by the indigenous vibration. And my most powerful offering there was the introduction of the language and seeing how the negative way of relating with the wound of the Middle Passage shifted when there was the introduction of simple call and response in our languages, how suddenly there were positive markers of self-identification. There was also what seemed as though it was a striving and impossible and could never be reached, just in being able to know that I can now sing a song, Nyakubingelela Goku, and yakvusela gogo, that what that does on a cellular level, you would literally, witnessed it in their postures where people would be downtrodden, head down. But the moment we started singing and I would speak all of the African languages, you would see an opening up, a relaxation settle over that person. So there is also a medicine to our indigenous languages that offers healings to a lot of modern being indigenous people who have been, whether by choice or by force, separated from the culture and the practice.
When you're a healer, you're dealing with a society. So therefore your language carries ideas of the society, ability to solve the problems of the society, because somebody comes now, is a ironsmith, somebody come is a hunter, somebody come is a wood carver, somebody come is a king, somebody come is a teacher in the village, in the society. So you are versed in explaining their problems in that way. And this is the importance of the institution of Ubungoma as one of the preservers of the language within the healing space. It's very, very, very important that we continue and we go further to do our own healing. I was checking, we're talking about prophecy and prophets, that we don't have these things. It's biblical and religious. And then when I look at what we have, is umhlahlo. Umhlahlo. I'm thinking this is very umhlahlo, uklahluba, uyabona le nto ne? So this is so profound that it is beginning to make a whole lot of sense. Uthi akuhlahla, uyabona? So it is umkhombandlela in a particular way, uyabona? But devoid of certain misrepresentation. At the same time, preserving its indigenousness in terms of what was originally meant when they say, like for instance, Botswana, they talk about today, like the common Setswana today, they say, Watsenwa, Osetsenwa. It is like they've reduced it to you're demented, you're mentally disturbed. But basically it comes from Otsenwe ke badimu, you are possessed. You understand? You're possessed by the ancestors. And which is very important too. I was reasoning with other people, I say, we don't get possessed by the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost. We get possessed by our ancestors. You understand me? Because it took 2 parents to bring you to life. But if we're going to count 400 years back, it took about 4,094 people to bring you into existence. Now, these are the building blocks of yourself. Your talent, your knowledge, your rare qualities that can't be even explained by anybody, including your own parents. Why Lomdana Anje is because you are the repository of all that was. And you're the ultimate representation of all that came through you, that brought you into existence. So, but these things, they are explainable more profoundly in the language that conceptualize this concept of reproducing ourselves. Like our immortality is in our offspring. Some people will talk about reincarnation, that they'll come back again and again. But from our African point of view, our immortality is in our offspring. You will clone yourself. That is why everyone living is named after someone who was once alive. Everyone living, igama lakhe nje, there's no way that your name is just yours alone. There was yes, back, if not a couple of generations back. But this speaks to this process of passing of knowledge from one generation to another in the names. The name, for instance, like Kasotho Tswana Speed, we say a name is Liina. But Liina means Liena, the self.
There's a certain scientific truth around the fact that language shapes our worldview. And having just the ability to speak all of these South African languages means that the lens within which I see myself, I see other people, I see the world, I carry already 11 different worldviews through which to experience life. And in a time like now where we're in, where mental illness is such a big reality, and a lot of mental health struggles are around being stuck in a limiting belief, but having this different lenses through which I can narrate my experience to myself. I can explore the challenges that I'm going through. On a brain level, there's this natural neuroplasticity, and neuroplasticity is when different pathways from your left and right brain connect and there's divergence. So it allows for me to hold a divergent worldview and therefore to not be stuck in the stories I tell myself, the stories I was told back home around this is the way the world works. That is the beauty of language. Also, I will come back to Siswati, Sangagitsi lenkuliswe ngaso. Sikuluma around when you build relations, kutsi kwakha buhlobo. And there is nothing legufaka ebantwini than even that attempt to meet them and have a curiosity in their language, where often in modern times we struggle in cultivating relationships. A lot of us are stuck in this sense of isolation. So language is also a powerful tool of being able kwakha lobuhlobo, and the luhlobo, which is also summer. And summer within itself carries such an energy of wanting to be outside, of abundance, of wanting to socialize. So that's another layer we can look into our languages, that our languages also just create and give us this space within which we can start to dismantle a lot of the systemic issues and come to a place of cultural humility. And I think that's what for me is at the core, is language teaches us cultural humility.
Then we get to Isithakazelo. Isithakazelo is your map. It maps you out. It talks about your allergies. Abanye bathi ke muthu wa usije dijo tsa maobane, like I don't eat ukudla kwa izolo. But now this is their allergies. It's in there Isithakazelo. Abanye umuntu angayenzi kanje na kanje na kanje. They are all explained in their Isithakazelo. So the preservation of indigenous languages comes with the preservation of the indigenous cultures, comes with the preservation of the indigenous concepts and ideas. Current generations have questions that what is it that we were believing in before we were colonized? What is it that we held to before we were educated and we get introduced other paradigm? Like for instance, the new age generation, they have a whole lot of choices. Some will tell that I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God or Satan for that matter. I just don't believe in anything. But within the African linguistic framework, there's no such thing. You can't even explain atheist. When you're coming from a society whereby no single language in Africa is devoid of the name of the Great Spirit, what the white men call God. You understand? There's no language in Africa, out of all our more than 3,000 languages that we speak in this continent as Abantu. All of them have a name for God. All of them have their cosmology. All of them have their own concept of origin. All of them have their first ancestor. Who's supposed to be responsible for passing the language, the culture, the rituals, the traditions, and so forth. So language is very, very, very important. Actually, the most radical thing that ever happened in the evolution of the human society was the development of the language itself. And again, we're speaking of our languages come from onomatopoeia Africa, whereby we say mutu because you go to when you walk. You self-name, we say isigidi because they will put a whole lot of seeds in a bag and when you drop it, go giddy. So it name itself. So we say a baboon is imfene, ngoba ifana nomuntu, kitweni when it's fana nemuntu. But baboon in the English language doesn't mean that which resembles man. So you see the part where we say isendwasitologa because there are things that we have they don't have. So now the struggle that we are having as Africans is we find ourselves in a position where we're engaging in linguistic comparative dynamics, whereby we linguistically compare things that are in other people's society with what are in our society because of their similarity. But similarity don't mean sameness. They might be similar, but they're not necessarily the same. So now in terms of language, we look at this thing and say, but in my language, what is this? We say ixoxo. Why? Because it, you know, because it, so it names itself. But if you say frog, what does a frog mean? You know, so it is important, one, to preserve our languages, two, to advocate them, three, to intellectualize them, that we need to intellectualize our languages, that they become language of invention, language of science, language of innovation.
Language. I would say it is the DNA of our very culture, language. For it is in language that our history is recorded, our cosmology is recorded. Language connects us with our stars, connects us with our rivers, connects us with our mountains, connects us with our plants, connects us with our ancient voices, connects us to music. Language has access to the ears. As a result, it has access to the heart, and it has access to the emotions. Therefore, language connects us with each other. Language is the DNA, for it is here that the language of our ancestors and our history has been decoded and handed over from one generation to another. Language gives us continuity, it gives us function, it gives us the ability to reach out to each other in an indigenous way. You know, for example, when you have modern children who say to you, daddy, you know, in our language you can't say you to someone, especially if they are older. Through our language, we're able to transmit our ethics, our morality, our behavior, and our very key values, what makes us African. And one of the key components over and above our dances and our foods. And I think one that would pitch the highest on the list is that of language. And language is one of the greatest gifts that we have been able to have to ourselves. Language gives us connection and access to our geographical sites, and the naming of these sites and the sacredness of these sites, the names which are given. For example, the mountains of Swaziland, you know, Malima, Alikonjwa mountains, which means you don't point at those mountains. When you look at Mount Kenya, you look at Mount Kilimanjaro, Runswori, you look at Chimanimani, Madzibadona, and the whole list of these geographical sites that we have in Africa, and that they're all kept and preserved in language. No wonder colonialism, when it comes into Africa, it has a great appetite in terms of changing our language or undermining our languages, or, you know, naming our places after their own selves and after their own gods and after their own understanding. Because when you take over people's language, you have been able to colonize them. Because once you are able to replace their language with your language, it therefore means that their communication, their way of thinking, their methods of processing data and information is no longer from themselves, but it is now towards them. So for example, in language, when you would say in English, you know, I'm getting married, you know, it already has a construct of, so when is the wedding? You know, who are the bridesmaids? You know, have you bought the dress? You know, who is doing the flowers for you? When you say I'm getting married in English, but if you say in Shona, ndakundo robogwa, or saying your lobola, or saying your locholo, people are not thinking of flowers and rings. We are thinking about, so did you get the middleman who's going to do the negotiation for you? Have you done the memulos? Have you Have you got your bridal, beadworks? Are your aunties in place? Have you gotten the cow to go and slaughter and celebrate? Just the difference between marriage, it makes a world of difference, and therefore in language, all these things are preserved, and language is the very, very DNA of our own history and our own culture. It is all kept right there. We do well teach our children their own language and teach them early, for we can be able to connect ourselves with them and preserve the very traditions for the betterment and the preservation of our African culture. My name is Maponga J from Farmers of Thought. I thank you. Don't do what I would do, but if you do it better.
Molweni gama lam nguBuhle Bendalo. I am a singer, a songwriter, and I believe I tell stories through my music. I grew up in Soweto, so you can imagine the influences when it comes to language. Growing up in Soweto, we're exposed to Xhosa people, Zulu-speaking people, Tsonga-speaking people. So your tongue tends to be switched, But I do try by all means to make sure that I use my home language when I write my music, when I tell my stories, which is isiXhosa. But I've been told that my Xhosa is too Soweto and my Zulu is too Xhosa, But those are the most languages, the two main languages that I use when I make my music. And I think it's important to always preserve that for our future generations. Sikhule kukho izaci namaqalo, mhlambe ngesingisi we may call it idioms, metaphors, but it's important. I make a point that I fuse those in my music and spark that curious mind of a listener to say, what does she mean when she says isala kutshela lebona ngomobu? It's important to be creative in our language preservation so that we make it palatable for the youth now. We call them Matuke. They must be able to connect through the music, but also still love where they come from and still appreciate their languages and still appreciate who they are, because preserving language is preserving the future and the history of what makes us as Abantu. So I think it's important in all our spaces, in all our industries, to try and preserve ilimi lethu, to try and preserve ulwimi lethu. So I embrace all the languages that birthed me and the streets that birthed this language in me. The Xhosa, Zulu, Sowetan speaking girl who also makes it a point that she relates to the listener and the consumer of the music.
South Africa, I'm going to say Southern Africa and put the Bantu or Manguni people in there. In our cultures, language is how we tell stories. Our stories tell our story in a sense that they tell our lineage from the beginning to where we are now. You see that when we speak of, in my culture, KwaZulu, when we speak of clan names, Ithakazelo, where you are reciting prominent members of your clan in years back, and it's a reflection for you as a person. It's a great honor to be called one, but also it's an indigenous way of communicating a sign of respect to elders in and around you. For me, indigenous language is very important. It's very important and something that needs to be preserved in its raw culture and nature for future generations to understand where they are, where as the culture we have begun, and where as a culture we are going, to keep the essence of who we are, whether it be Umzulu, Xhosa, Setswana, Pedi. It's a key part of your identity as an African child to have that connection with your African nature. What else is there? What am I thinking about? For me, it's an integral part of who we are, especially when we look at the history of South Africa and we look at the history predating where we were in a system designed to eradicate our identity as black people. It was the method, and it has been the method, where a lot of our culture and rituals were banned, where the method of storytelling and relaying stories from so great grandmothers and great grandfathers going down the line to kids and in that nature, it has been the way we have carried our culture going forward, which is maybe why our culture does seem a bit all over the place, because it was not written down. It had to be spoken. We weren't allowed to keep records of our culture. We weren't allowed to be as a person. We were fighting a system designed in all aspects to eradicate that identity of you as a person. So when you speak of indigenous language, you're speaking of your essence as a black person, as a black child in this country. And in some ways it speaks towards the fight of still surviving, and the fact that it is still here in this time and age, and it has survived and will keep surviving through our efforts alone in a world that's designed to take away that gift from the younger generation, leading them towards the common language, which is English, or common languages around the world. It's important in our life, and it's imperative actually to maintain that while the world requires English, our spirit requires our indigenous language to carry on.
Indigenous languages are very core to our identity in a way that we underrate, because they are the connection that we have to our cultures, to our traditions, to the norms that we practice, to the proverbs that we say, to the wisdom that is carried in the stories of our history. There are a lot of things, a lot of nuances, there's a lot of art that gets lost. There's a lot of meaning that gets lost when you translate a lot of our languages into other languages. And you end up losing the meaning, you end up losing the art, you end up losing the feeling of the language. Uma ngithi ngeSiswati siyoyicela ivuthiwe, someone else will understand exactly what I mean, and they would understand the urgency of what I mean. I am all for the translation of languages. I'm all for translation and common languages. I'm also for the modernization of ourselves. As the world changes, we cannot remain the same. But I would like to modernize within those indigenous languages, such that we do not lose the meaning. Because languages are so important to our identity, what we do not realize is that the moment you lose your indigenous language, very soon you lose expression, or you lose even the significance of other things of culture, such as your traditions, your beliefs, your norms, and your values.
Our indigenous languages, our African indigenous languages, are absolutely vital. They're not only vital because they connect us to our cultural identity, they connect us to our ancestral wisdom, they connect us to who we are, and they preserve our own cultures. But they're important because they are a critical element that actually helps us, and the wisdom that we take from our ancestors is not just something that is about learning and understanding your history, but it's about something that is actually helps us navigate our everyday life. I think about it as something that really is connected to the current, and that we need to preserve so that it can have that connection into the future. I think about our languages from a perspective, a simple or a practical example could be just your name. If you have an African name and an African surname, each time that name is called, it has a meaning. It's a praise, and it's a declaration, and it's almost like I think of it as a prayer, for a lack of a better word. and if you don't understand that, you lose that connection with that part of your own identity and that part of who you are, and you're not actually able to respond to it in a way that you can actually respond to it in a way that is affirming to your identity, but affirming to you, and who you are and where you are going as a person. I also always think about it as, when you understand who you are, you understand your language, it also guides you in terms of how you behave. Because if I am, who I am based on my name and my surname, I live up to that. It's almost like a brand of who I am, that my ancestors have set up and my family is set up for me to follow through. So for me, language is not something that is just about cultural symbolism. It is something that is critical about our everyday life. It helps us, and it's a living aspect of who we are in our culture. It's dynamic. It connects us to the past, which connects us to today, and connects us to the future, because you know what, actually all three are happening concurrently, all the time in terms of the world that we're in. You think about healing, and you think about really the job that we have to do as Africans, which is to reconnect and go back to remembering who we are and fix that fractures that are the history, our modern history has created in our societies. I think of language as a critical part of creating that link, because you start listening in and you really listen into our language and the words, and it starts giving you clues and answers into what we need to do and how we need to take things into the future. And also, African languages, Africa is the oldest continent. We are the oldest people. We have the oldest languages, and everything else in the world is born, from those languages. And therefore, if we are not preserving those languages over time, we're going to stagnate. We know what happens when things stagnate. Things that are no longer living and that stagnate, they rot and they die. So I always think of it that way. It's absolutely critical. Thank you.
Sanbona, I am a man who loves books. Yet I am ashamed when I look at my bookshelf. You can see one of my bookshelves behind me. Ezincwadini zami zonke angazi zingaka, angaze ngiyibale, kodwa mhlawumbe zilishumi kuphela izincwadi ezibhalwe ngolimi lwebele, ulimi lwesiZulu. Lokho kuthini ngathi, uthini ngami? Ngumuntu othanda izincwadi noma ngingumuntu othanda isingisi? Lesi singisi lesi silimaza kakhulu isizukulwane esisikhulisayo, abantwana bethu. Ezincwadini zami zesiZulu uyabona nje, ziningi engizithengele abantwana ngiyabafundela isiZulu, ngiyabafundisa nesiZulu la ekhaya, ngoba esikoleni bafunda isingisi neAfrikaans. Sizamile ukuthi kufakwe isiZulu noma ulimi nje lwesintu, noma kuthiwa isitswana noma yiliphi ulimi lwesintu noma isipedi esikoleni, kwaba umzukuzuku, kwaliwa nje impela. Abaphathi bethi abekho othisha and abanayo icapacity, abazali abaningi bafuna ukufundiswa ngesingisi, and iAfrikaans abanankinga nayo, but abanye bethu banenkinga-ke neAfrikaans. Silondoloza kanjani ulimi lwesintu, izilimi zethu zesintu sizilondoloza kanjani uma thina qobo lwethu singenazo izincwadi zesintu noma ulimi lwebele? Ezincwadini enginazo zesiZulu kunalena kaJobe, incwadi yokuphila kwethu, isahluko sokuqala, umbhalo kaJobe, incwadi yezinkondlo. Kube khona ekakhulekani Zondi, a glossary of law terms, English isiZulu, bilingual glossary series published by UKZN. Basically dictionary yama terms omthetho, legal terms. Ngisebenzisa uma ngitolika ngoba umsebenzi wami ngingumtoliki. Kube khona le ngayithatha kudadewethu eSwatini ethi eka-IS kubheka kungavuka abanguni inovel yesiZulu endala. Enye ke ngayithenga eThekwini kusakhona iAdams Books ithi ayikho indawo yokucasha nezinye izindaba. Abadidile okumangalisayo abadidiyeli balencwadi bangabelumbi uDorothy Dyer noRosamund Hayden. Nansi ayikho indawo yokucasha. Bese kuba khona eka uManze Coffee nezakhe ekaMtungwa uFred Khumalo nangu uManze Coffee nezakhe incwadi nje like fantasy. I won't call it a children's book, but indaba ezithi ukuba ifantasy kuba zinganekwane thizeni kodwa esifundisa kakhulu. Library yakababa uMasi Sibunene ngathola lencwadi ka MSS Dumisa ngayiboleka empeleni inkatha yabaphansi ngoba ngifuna ukwenza umsebenzi weshashalazi ngayo nayo iwumsebenzi weshashalazi waseshashalazini inkatha yabaphansi ngigcinile le ncwadi bese kuba khona abantu abamnyama lapha bavela khona kaMagema Fuze abantu abamnyama lapha bavela khona kaMagema Fuze bese kuba khona kusadliwa ngoludala mina ngayithola e-library sisarana i-resource center e-Beth Center ilotshwe usithi Msimang. Bese kuba khona ke impi yabomdabu isethunjini a novel by ubaba uButhelezi JC Buthelezi ebengizohabula kuyona kancane. Bese kuba khona ezinye ke nansi enye kababa uMazi Sibunene engayithenga eThekwini amalokotho kaNomkhubulwane, probably my favorite book in my entire bookshelf, amalokotho kaNomkhubulwane ngenxa yokujula kwayo iqukethe ukuhlakanipha okuningi. Kungani singasifundi isiZulu? Kungani isiZulu noma izilimi zethu zesintu singazinakekeli kangaka? Nenye ke lana ezinye incwadi zabantwana engizifundela abantwana lena umlingo wezindaba. Uma sikhuluma ngokongeka la ngiphethe ngesandla uGrand Malume ekasizakele udadewethu lona osizakele uLankosi sizakele Nkosi uGrand Malume. Ngizolihabulela inkondlo yakhona noma ibhalwe ngesingisi but ikhona ekufundisayo. Uyabona ukulondoloza ulimi lwesintu noma izilimi zesintu kungumshikashika onzima nalabo abashicilelayo izincwadi abaqikeleli ukuthi abantu kumele bebhale ngolimi lwabo lwesintu. Lokhu mina ngikubona sengathi kuhlangene nesimo somnotho nesimo sezombusazwe ikakhulukazi ezweni elifana neNingizimu Afrika. Imfundo ibukeka sengathi into equkethwe lapha esingisini kuphela. Noma zikhona izincwadi ezibhalwe ngesintu ngisho nama-bookshops uqobola ngeke ayikho nje i-bookshop engeke ngangena kuyona ngathola izincwadi zesintu kuphela.
Languages can disappear if they are not spoken, and there's no literature on certain languages. Languages, depending on each and every place in geography, they sometimes become diluted as we interact with different people from different cultures, who speak different languages from us. Without language, we cannot be able to talk about our culture, because language and culture are glove in hand. They exist, they coexist with each other. There's certain concepts that you cannot explain. You cannot explain, you cannot translate, because the essence of the meaning is lost in translation. A lot of books, even spiritual books, that we read today, because of translation, meanings were lost. I'll make an example. My name, Nomden. Whenever I meet people who do not come from my culture, whenever I meet people who do not understand my language, and they ask me to translate the name, I end up having to tell them a story. Because if I do direct translation, the meaning of my name is lost. Its essence becomes lost. Language also, the importance of language is that it places you at a certain place. So geography, when somebody speaks from eThekwini, their isiZulu dialect is not the same as a person who's from Emadadeni, a person obuya eNquthu. isiZulu asifani. Same applies to isiXhosa. Umuntu ophuma eCape Town kwaLanga does not sound the same as umuntu ophuma eGini. So when people speak, you can actually place them exactly where they're from, based on the language that they're speaking. Language also puts us with timeline, because as we are evolving as people, as we are adding certain words that did not exist a long time ago. Our ancestors would not know Maponga television. Our ancient ancestors will not know ukuthi yini makhalekhukhwini, cell phone, smartphone. So as we grow these languages and we preserve them, they will also place at which century did people speak like this? What kind of tools did people use in those times? I'm going to come back to culture. Let us teach our children our indigenous languages so that we do not have to explain our concepts. For an example, if ngitshela umntwana and say sizoba nomgidi wabantu abadala. So if my child does not speak our language and I try to break down this concept, it can be a bit of a trick, because it is not a worship ceremony. It is a ceremony that is rooted in our culture and our customs. Another concept, masithi siyaphahla. And somebody says, what is to phahla? Is it a prayer? If I put it as a prayer, then it loses what it is, because phahla is communicating with self, communicating with the universe, communicating with your guides. So, while prayer, it is a person sending out a petition, sometimes we patla, just to commune with those that came before us. So, the issue of language becomes very, very important, because when you are speaking your language, even your demeanor is actually highlighted. How we address our elders as African children is not the same way that we address your friends. How you address your partner is not the same way like how other people from other cultures address their partners. How you teach your children is not the same way as how other cultures are teaching their children. And all this is rooted in language, our culture, our way, who we are, the essence of who we are as African people. So let us not listen to those who think our language is outdated, that speaking our language is not cool. Yes, we are forced by platforms like this, because I'm talking to a broader community, people who don't necessarily speak my language, the language that I speak, that I'm speaking in English. But how beautiful it is when I tell people that I can speak more than 8 languages. They're like, wow. It is because whenever I meet a person or Mshangana, I understand their culture. I meet umuntu omvenda. Because of the language, I understand their culture. I meet umuntu omSwati. I understand the culture. And all the rites of passages that each and every one of our cultures have, from birth to being a teenager, to umemolo, to ubushado, for those who got married, it is a rite of passage, up until we get to the point where when we cease to exist in this dimension, we have rites of passages that we perform. And they're easily explained in our languages, because culture and language are glove in hand. Let us not lose it. Let us not one day talk about a language that would say, our children will say, long time ago, we used to speak Siswati, or we speak Zulu. It should be who they are, because it brings them to who they are and who their forefathers were when they came speaking. Yeah,